On August the 24th, 79 AD, the volcano Vesuvius, in a fertile area of the Campania region, suddenly erupted with devastating force, wiping out the towns and villages around it. Today, one of those towns has come back to light, telling us about the splendor of a world we thought was buried forever. Pompei. Why do millions of visitors flock to a place that has been dead for 20 centuries? Perhaps because it represents a unique crossroads in history where two civilizations come together, ours and the Romans 2,000 years ago. At the time of the eruption, Pompei was a busy town in the Campania region. It was not a new settlement. On the contrary, it had been founded 700 years previously, and then taken over by the Etruscans, the Greeks, the Samnites, and finally by the Roman legions in 80 BC, when the town became a Roman colony. In what turned out to be the last century of its life. A century during which the town increased its importance as a trading centre and a resort area much frequented by wealthy Roman citizens who built themselves large villas adorned with many splendid works of art. The first sign of impending disaster came in 62 AD, when the whole area around Mount Vesuvius was rocked by a devastating earthquake, which caused immense damage in Pompei as well as many victims. The rest of the story is well known. 17 years later, while reconstruction work was still underway, Mount Vesuvius suddenly erupted, turning a busy seaside town into a place of death and destruction. It was a Thursday, the day dedicated to Jupiter. But on that day, the father of the gods did not watch over the town where he was venerated as its protector. An enormous mass of volcanic ash and stones, known as lapilli, was ejected by the eruption, falling back over the next few hours to cover the whole region like a deadly shroud, followed by a dense cloud of poisonous gases, killing every form of life. The effects were catastrophic. In less than 48 hours, a flourishing town was cancelled from the face of the earth. The memory of the disaster and of the town itself gradually faded away. It was not until 17 centuries later that the town of Pompei re-emerged again, thanks to King Charles of Bourbon and to teams of archaeologists who brought it back to life with the most extraordinary restoration of all time. The entrance to the excavation site is through Porta Marina, one of the 7 gates in Pompei's town walls. The original gate had 2 openings, the smaller one for pedestrians, the larger one for carts and wagons bringing goods, mainly fish and salt, into the town from the port at the mouth of the river Sarno. Alongside the main gate, Porta Marina, we see the terme suburbane, suburban baths, dating from the 1st century AD. The Romans were very fond of public baths, places not only for body care but also for socializing in pleasant surroundings and, of course, catching up on the latest gossip. The dressing room has several erotic wall paintings, and there are many others in Pompei, including a scene involving 2 women, something that was rarely depicted in the ancient world. However, there were separate areas for men and for women in the baths. Further on we come to the frigidarium for cold baths, decorated with stuccos, seascapes, splendid frescoes with a small waterfall in the background. Then comes the tepidarium and the calidarium for warm and hot baths, with 3 windows looking out over the surroundings. Once inside the town, we come to the focal point of religious and social life. This is the Temple of Apollo, one of the oldest in Pompei, built during the first half of the 6th century BC. The temple was surrounded by a double colonnade and adorned with sacrificial altars and statues of divinities. Today we can admire the copies of a statue of Apollo and, on the other side, that of a bust of Diana. At the foot of the entrance steps we find an altar in travertine stone with an inscription saying that the altar was built by the Quattorviri, the town governors. Another Doric column has a sundial on it with an inscription saying that it was erected by the 2 Duoveri, Lucio Sepurnio and Marco Erenio. In front of the temple of Apollo stands the Basilica, a large rectangular building used for conducting business affairs and for administering justice. It dates back to the 2nd century BC, and at the time was the most important public building in the town. In the background we can see the remains of the law court or tribunal, approached by a flight of wooden steps. It was slightly raised above the ground level, not only to give it a commanding position, but also to protect the magistrates from the anger of the crowd, although trials at the time were conducted with all the measures we still use: counsel for the prosecution, for the defense, and court officials to safeguard the rights of the accused. The Forum was the focus of the town's political, administrative and religious life. It was surrounded by a colonnade with 2 tiers, decorated with arches, statues and fountains. In the background stood the Temple of Jupiter, the main religious building, which was erected in the 2nd century BC. It housed the statue of the god, the public treasury, known as the aerarium, and votive offerings. The building known as Eumachia's house belonged to a priestess of Venus and her rich family of farmers and merchants who had made their fortune in the wool trade. This large two-story building was one of the most impressive in the Forum. A small niche holds a statue of the priestess, dedicated to the corporation of the fulloniche, or weavers, dyers and launderers, one of the most important activities in Pompei. The temple of Vespasian was the place where the emperor was honoured. Originally the temple was dedicated to Augustus. Logically, it was updated every now and then with the name of the reigning emperor. So, at the time of the eruption, we find that it was dedicated to the Emperor Vespasian. In front of it, we can still see an altar in white marble, with a bas-relief depicting a bull being sacrificed. The macellum was the main market for meat and fish, and was surrounded by small shops. In the middle there was a rotunda with 12 columns covered by a dome with a pool. Excavations in this area have brought to light fish bones as well as remains of fruit and cereals. It is thought that there were several shops at the front of the buildings, probably for money changers, known as argentari. The Arch of Tiberius was the main entrance to the heart of the town, and was one of many which were customarily erected in honour of the emperors. The stone structure was faced with marble and adorned with statues and other decorative features, and must have been a truly spectacular sight in its day. A little further on there is another fine arch at the beginning of Via di Mercurio. This one was dedicated to the Emperor Caligula and was topped by a larger-than-life equestrian statue. Near the Arch of Caligula we can see the remains of the Temple of Fortuna Augusta, built at the time of Augustus. It stands on a raised podium approached by 2 flights of steps. We know that this monument was erected by a private citizen, Marco Tullio. Private houses in Pompei are one of its main attractions, since they give us a wonderful picture of how Roman families lived in the 1st century AD. Some homes were very luxurious, with all mod cons such as toilets and running water, sometimes including small thermal baths. This is the house of Pansa, whose layout reflects the typical model of a Roman dwelling. Here is the impluvium, a system of stone gutters for collecting rainwater in a cistern. And this is the peristylium, a small garden, usually encircled by columns, with various rooms looking onto it, including the dining room, known as the triclinium. This little garden made the house seem like a country villa in the centre of town. A little further on we come to the house of the tragic poet, which owes its name to a splendid mosaic depicting a theatre scene. Although it is perhaps better known for another mosaic at the entrance with a warning for visitors, Cave Canem, or Beware of the Dog. Let's see what the house might have looked like at the time of the eruption. The atrium with its impluvium, the service rooms, a small garden where there is a lararium, in other words, a small temple dedicated to the household gods. The triclinium, or dining room, is decorated with 2 frescoes. Venus with Cupids and Ariana abandoned. Another beautiful fresco from this house, depicting the sacrifice of Iphigenia, is in the Naples National Archeological Museum. The most famous dwelling in Pompei is the House of the Faun. Dating from around the 2nd century BC, it covers an area of over 3,000 square meters. The house is renowned for the copy of the wonderful statuette of a dancing faun, which stands in the fountain of the impluvium in the entrance area. The house contains some extraordinary works of art, such as a famous mosaic which covered the floor of one of the main rooms, depicting one of the battles, perhaps the Battle of Isso, when Alexander the Great defeated the Persian king Darius. The mosaic is a masterpiece, made up of something like 1.5 million small coloured tesserae. The beautiful garden is encircled by porticos with columns overlooked by the main rooms, all of which were adorned with marvellous works of art. Statues, wall paintings, mosaics showing animals, sea creatures, mythological scenes, Egyptian-style settings. Most of these are now on display in the Naples National Archeological Museum and give a good idea of the splendour and wealth of this villa at the time. We continue with our tour of the most interesting dwellings in Pompei, trying to imagine what they must have looked like in the past. This is the house of the Ara Massima, a relatively small house, but one with delightful decorations which suggest that it probably belonged to someone of high social standing who also had extremely refined taste. The name of Lucretius Frontoni appears in several graffiti inside and outside this sumptuous villa, which belonged to an important figure in the political life of the town. In the entrance area, we see the traditional impluvium with its drain for collecting rainwater in a cistern. The whole villa is frescoed with splendid mythological scenes, perhaps painted by the only one of the town's artists who signed his works, a certain Lucio. Here they are, the love of Mars and Venus, the triumph of Dionysus and Ariadne, Theseus, showing Ariana giving him the thread with which he escaped from the labyrinth. Narcissus admiring his reflection in a pool. And finally, at the end of the garden, a large African landscape showing plants and animals. So this was a luxurious villa, but all this wealth could not prevent the tragedy of the eruption. 7 members of the household were found all together in one room where they had sought refuge from the disaster. Now we come to the House of the Gilded Cupids, which takes its name from a series of cupids cut into gold leaf adorning part of the peristylium. The many fine artworks contained in the rooms make it one of the most splendid villas in Pompei. The design and layout of the gardens included busts of the gods, reliefs depicting Dionysian subjects, masks hanging between the columns, sculptures set into the walls, in a setting which reflected not so much everyday life, but rather a vision of a surreal artistic world. There is a little temple dedicated to the household gods, or lares, on one side of the peristylium, the large garden around which the villa is laid out. Near the garden we find a saccello, or shrine, dedicated to the divine Egyptian triad of Harpocrate, Isis and Serapis, flanked by the god Anubis with a dog-like head. One of the most famous houses in Pompei is the House of the Vetii, which belonged to 2 wealthy merchants. In the entrance area, there is a notorious figure of Priapus, shown in the act of weighing his enormous phallus, a symbol against the evil eye, on a pair of scales. The other tray holds a money bag. From here we come to the main atrium with the impluvium in the middle. Behind it, through a small kitchen, we come to a cubicle or small bedroom containing another statuette of Priapus with a hollow phallus through which water could flow, used as a fountain in the garden. The walls of the cubicle are decorated with several small frescoes showing erotic scenes. The peristylium, or garden, was the focal point of the villa and was laid out with flower beds, fountains and statues. Lead pipes carried water to the fountains, streams and pools. But the real marvel of this villa are the wall paintings. We see them everywhere, especially in 2 small sitting rooms with frescoed walls where members of the household could relax while looking out over the garden. The first contains a scene showing Hercules as a child, killing the snakes sent by Juno in a fit of jealousy because her husband Jupiter had fathered him with another woman, Alcmena. On the rear wall, we see the suffering of Pentheus, king of Thebes, torn to pieces by the Bacchantes after refusing to allow the Dionysian cult to be practiced in his city. On the right-hand wall there is the suffering of Dirce, queen of Thebes, who was tied to a bull by the twins Amphione and Zetus after Dirce had imprisoned their mother. In the second room we see the Passion of Pasiphae, showing Daedalus presenting Pasiphae, wife of the king of Crete, with a wooden cow in order to attract the bull she was in love with. Their coupling would produce the Minotaur, with a human body and a bull's head. On the rear wall, we see the suffering of Icione, who was taken into the sky by Jupiter. When he tried to rape Jupiter's wife Hera, she was saved by a cloud, which took on the shape of her body. This coupling produced the Centaurs, with horse-like bodies and human faces. On the last wall, we see Ariana awakened by Bacchus on the island of Naxos, while Theseus flees on board a ship. On the other side of the peristelium, we come to the large triclinium, one of the most spectacular sights that has come down to us from ancient times. The walls are dominated by the classic cinnabar red, known as Pompei red, and are crossed by black bands which create various areas of the composition. The most important is the lower cornice, with a celebrated frieze of cupids at work and playing sports. They are selling flowers, making perfumes, driving chariots drawn by antelopes, making jewellery, and many more, making up a scene that is extraordinary for its artistic and technical details. The House of the Labyrinth adjoins the House of the Vetii and is another fine example of a Sanitic dwelling dating from the 2nd century BC. It gets its name from a mosaic found in the house representing a labyrinth. The influence of Egyptian culture was very strong in Pompei, and there are traces of it in many places. For example, this delightful River Nile fresco can be seen in what is known as the House of the Pygmies. It depicts scenes on the banks of the Nile with palm trees, sandy beaches, animals, and a number of pygmy-like figures. The love of art and decoration which the people of Pompeii had is shown by these figures, including the delightful head of a piglet painted on the wall of a room that hardly needed it, in other words, a small kitchen. Two more houses, known as the Large Fountain and the Small Fountain, get their names from the two fountains at the rear of the tablinum, splendidly decorated with stuccos and seashells. The house of Paquius Proculus contains a splendid mosaic floor, still in excellent condition. The house of the Cei family dates from the Sanitic period in the history of Pompeii. On the wall at the end of the garden, there is a large painting depicting an impressive hunting scene. Continuing our tour, we come to the House of the Ancient Hunt, which gets its name from a wall painting in the garden depicting a hunting scene belonging to the 4th style, that is, the last in the history of Pompei. The house, known as the Villa of Cicero, contains this wonderful mosaic showing a group of people dancing to the sound of a tambourine. The whole scene is reminiscent of what happens in Naples today, part of Neapolitan folklore. Many stretches of the ancient town walls are still in excellent condition, along with a number of square-shaped towers which acted as lookout posts. The best known is the 2-story Tower of Mercury. From the top of this tower there is a fine view of the whole town and the surrounding countryside. At the far northwest corner of the town walls stands the Herculaneum Gate, one of 7 leading into the town. The gate stands on Via dei Sepolcri, leading to one of the cemeteries, all of which were situated outside the town walls. Another large cemetery was located outside the Nocera Gate. The monuments here were a way of displaying the wealth and importance of a family. The tombs at Porta Nocera are fine examples of Roman art and architecture as applied to funeral monuments. As a resort town and important trading centre, Pompei had a constant flow of visitors and travellers passing through, whose business and entertainment needs had to be catered for. So we find inns and taverns everywhere, as well as many thermopolia, which were similar to our present-day snack bars, and were also brightened up with lively wall paintings. There were also many bakeries known as pistrine, which doubled as flour mills where bread was made and sold. The flour was milled between 2 large stones of volcanic origin, and the dough was then baked in a brick oven. There were also several barbers' shops, and even a betting shop, showing how the people of Pompei were as fond of gambling as the Romans were. Apart from the suburban ones, there were 3 public baths in the town centre. This is the tepidarium of the Forum Baths, a barrel-vaulted room heated by a large brazier. Along the walls there was a long shelf holding statuettes in terracotta depicting Telamons. Alongside is the Calidarium, with a large hot water pool and a smaller one for cold water. Here we can still see the inscription by the magistrates who had the baths erected, this time with public funds. One of the marvels of the Roman world was the aqueducts. The main aqueduct for Pompei was built by Augustus, and it was an extraordinary feat of engineering. About 60 miles long, it began at the source of the river Serino on the slopes of the Apennines, passing to the north of Mount Vesuvius, to supply no less than 9 towns and cities, including Naples. The water reached Pompei near the Porta Vesuvio gate, at the town's highest point. There, a large collecting tank, the Castellum Aquae, distributed the water in 3 directions to supply all the public fountains and baths, as well as shops and the homes of the rich. A lot of water was used by the laundries and dye workshops, called fulloniche in Latin. There were many of these workshops, so much so that the workers, or fullones, were important members of the community. The pieces of cloth were soaked and washed in large pools, using feet to trample on them, in a mixture of water and urine, used instead of soda for its ammonia content. Lupa in Latin means prostitute, so a lupanara was a brothel. There were many places in Pompei which were also used for prostitution, but the one we see here was just a brothel and nothing else. It was on 2 floors with 10 small rooms, 5 quite large rooms on the upper floor and another 5 on the ground floor, smaller and lacking in privacy. Each room had a solid bed in brick or stone over which sacking was laid to provide some measure of comfort, though not very hygienic. The entrance and the walls of the rooms were decorated with erotic scenes depicting the various delights offered by the ladies of the house. These places were frequented for the most part by ordinary citizens and visitors to the city, while the wealthy took their pleasures in more comfortable surroundings, often using their slaves, whose services were, of course, free. The Triangular Forum was another large area set aside for social and religious purposes, in addition to the Forum at Porta Marina. As its name implies, it is clearly shaped like a triangle. This sacred area was the site of a Greek temple dating from the mid-6th century BC, whose position gave it a wonderful view out over the sea. The southern part was occupied by a Doric temple, as well as a rectangular building dating from Roman times, known as the Aeron, which seems to have been used to celebrate the cult of Hercules, the legendary founder of the town. Further south, there is a well carved out of the solid lava. Over time, this had taken on some sort of religious significance, since it was incorporated into a tholos, a circular construction with Doric columns in tufu. The Roman world was open-minded and tolerant about all religions. One example of this is the Temple of Isis. It was the first religious building to be repaired after the earthquake in 62 AD, demonstrating once again the strong influence that Egyptian culture had on the Roman world. Like several other buildings, this one was built at private expense, in this case by an ex-slave who had been freed. Since he could not hold public office, he had a stone plaque made naming his 6-year-old son as the benefactor. The original building, dating back to the 2nd century BC, stood on a raised podium approached by a flight of steps. The National Archeological Museum in Naples has a large collection of finds and artworks taken from the temple, like this scene depicting the myth of Ios, the priestess of Hera Argiva, arriving at Canopus and releasing Argus from prison. Near the triangular forum, we come to the theatre district. Pompei had two public theatres. The smaller one, known by the Greek word Odeon, was built around 80 BC by the same two public figures, duoveri, who had previously erected the town's amphitheatre. The Odeon had a permanent roof and could hold about 1,300 spectators, and there's every reason to suppose that the performances were equally sophisticated, for the most part consisting of music and mime. The large theatre was erected in the 2nd century BC and could hold about 5,000 spectators. It was fully equipped for all types of theatre performances, including elaborate shows involving running water. The seating area was normally open and uncovered, but to shelter the audience from sun or rain, it could be completely covered by an immense canvas awning known as a velarium. Behind the large theatre, there is an extensive area which was given over to the gladiator barracks, in other words, the place where they were housed and trained before going into the arena. Today the whole area is a sort of museum for graffiti, giving us an insight into the life and hardships of these men, some of whom achieved fame and reputation. This is the vast arena where many of the gladiators and other victims died. We are on the eastern edge of the town, where there is a huge amphitheatre, the oldest and the best preserved that has come down to us. The Romans, as we know, were passionately keen on games and shows, especially those involving gladiators. The amphitheatre was built around 70 BC by two magistrates, Caius Quincio Valgus and Marcus Porciu, at their own expense. The whole cavea could be covered by an immense canvas awning, or velarium, to shelter the spectators from sun or rain. Gladiators came from amongst slaves and prisoners of war and were specially trained to fight in the arena. The bloodthirsty crowd of thousands of spectators included a large number of women who adored these muscular heroes, according to all accounts. For this reason, women were allotted seats in the upper tiers of the amphitheatre to keep them at a distance. Now we move on to another splendid patrician house. This one, known as the House of Menandrus, belonged to Quintus Pompeius Sabinus. It was put up around the mid-3rd century BC and covered an area of almost 2,000 square meters. The owner must have been really well off, as we can see from this wonderful silver plate collection, 118 pieces weighing about 24 kilos, found in the cellars along with a hoard of valuable coins. There is a delightful small temple of the Lares or household gods, and all the rooms were adorned with wonderful frescoes. In this niche we see Menandrus, the Greek poet, author of the New Comedy, who lived in Athens in the late 4th century BC. Another painting shows Athenion turned into a deer and torn to pieces by his dogs after having spied on Diana while she was bathing. Here we see an encounter between a satyr and a Maenad, while this yellow room contains frescoes in the 4th style. This is the room where several skeletons were found, of people who had gone back into the house to collect their belongings, but who were overcome by the poisonous gases all the same. Another room contained the skeleton of the housekeeper, clutching a bag of gold coins, as well as that of a child. This house had every comfort and convenience, including a private thermal bath, which was elaborately decorated. The atrium has a large pool surrounded by 8 columns, leading to a calidarium decorated with a wonderful mosaic on the floor, depicting a slave holding out a jar of unguent to the owner, as well as a seascape. The House of the Centenary got its name because it was excavated in 1879, the 18th centenary of the eruption. In the middle of the garden there is a pool, near which a marvellous bronze statue of a satyr pouring wine from a jug was found. To the rear of the peristyllium there is a nymphaeum with a mosaic-lined niche from which water flows into the bowl below. Other rooms are adorned with fine frescoes, including some on erotic subjects. Again in the theatre district, we come to the house of the Larario of Achilles, which takes its name from a shrine to the household gods, Lares, situated in a corner of the atrium. This takes the form of a small temple adorned with mythological scenes, while the lower frieze shows the final stages of the Trojan War. In another area, there is a wall painting showing 2 large elephants. Again near the amphitheatre, we see more of Pompei's fine dwellings. This is the house of Loreio Tiburtino, built during the Sanitic period, but later enlarged and restructured according to the fashionable style in the 1st century BC. It was a luxury residence, as shown by the elegant painted decorations adorning the rooms and some of the outside walls in the splendid garden, making it into a country villa in the centre of town. There are many other fine works to admire in this villa. In the background, we can see a wall painting of Pyramus and Thisbe, lovers who committed suicide together, and another of Narcissus falling in love with his reflection. On the subject of these paintings, it's interesting to note that they are amongst the few in the whole of Pompei signed by the artist. In particular, a certain Lucius, who signed his works with the words Lucius Pinxit, or painted by Lucius. Another water channel, about 50 meters long, crossed the large garden. Perhaps it was meant to look like a miniature river Nile, since it was flanked by several statuettes dedicated to the cult of the god Isis. Around the sides of the garden, there were covered porticos for the guests to stroll along. The whole setting must have been a truly wonderful sight in its day. Alongside the house of Loreio Tiburtino, we come to the house of Venus on a Shell, which was only excavated in 1952. It obviously belonged to a very wealthy citizen, and it takes its name from a splendid painting on the back wall of the large peristyllium, which depicts Venus reclining on a shell, borne on the waves and supported by 2 cupids. This fresco is flanked by two smaller paintings, one portraying Mars and the other a fountain. The villa of Giulia Felice belonged to a woman who had a good nose for business, since she was able to exploit her large property during the housing crisis which struck the town after the disastrous earthquake in 62 AD. Apparently she rented out part of it to wealthy tenants. The finest part of the villa overlooks the large garden. There is an elegant portico made of fluted marble pillars with Corinthian capitals, flanked by a beautiful summer triclinium, all made of marble, with a stepped fountain. A niche at the back of the garden was probably dedicated to the cult of Isis and contained a splendid bronze tripod, now on display in the Naples National Archeological Museum. We end our tour of Pompei in one of its most famous areas. This is the Villa of the Mysteries, a large suburban house situated to the north of the town in a wonderful panoramic position. The earliest part of the building dates from the 2nd century BC, but subsequently it was enlarged and became a splendid patrician villa. At the time of the catastrophe, the villa had been turned into a thriving agricultural business. This is shown by the large kitchens and working areas where the torcularium has been reconstructed, a large wooden pole with a ram's head at one end, which was used to press the grapes. A curiosity is a small graffito on a wall, the caricature of a senator, whose name we know thanks to a scratched inscription, Rufus. The reason why this villa is so famous is for its wall paintings, beginning with those in a cubicle, a small bedroom. However, the villa's real treasure can be seen in the room alongside, one of the most extraordinary wall paintings to come down to us from antiquity. A real masterpiece covering 3 walls. One of the many interpretations of the scene is that it may depict the high points of a ceremony relating to the cult of Dionysus. These rituals were so widespread in Roman times that the Senate eventually took action to repress the orgies that they involved. The painting gives us a wonderful spectacle with no less than 29 figures. It begins with the introduction to the ritual, showing a naked young man. Alongside this, there is a pastoral scene with old Silenus playing the lyre and Paniska feeding a kid goat. In the meantime, a young girl runs away terrorized, overwhelmed by what she sees in the following scenes. Silenus offers a drink to a satyr, while another tries to frighten him away with the reflection of a tragic mask in a jug of wine. A little further away, Dionysus, drunk and half-naked, reclines in Ariana's lap. Continuing with this visual narrative, we see a young girl who is uncovering the basket of mysteries containing the phallus, symbol of nature's generative forces. She is flanked by a winged demon about to castigate another girl who is turning to a matron for protection. Alongside, a naked Bacchante moves gently and light-footed in a dance. All in all, this work is one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of art, a masterpiece of form and content in an unforgettable image which alone is worth a visit. Our tour of Pompei finishes here. The town still stands before our eyes, though emptied of the crowd of visitors flooding through it every day. In our mind's eye, the people still seem to be living there as they did so many years ago. Silent shadows wander the streets in desperation, recounting the life, the art and the genius of a civilization that has disappeared forever, but which still proudly shows the marred beauty of a wonderful town. The memory of the town's ancient splendor still fascinates us, while making us reflect on the capriciousness of cruel fate which sacrificed the people in order to make them immortal.